Hey, good morning. So we're up to Shin Lamed Tes. We're halfway through Daled. V'lo Mekadchin. So we're discussing all the various miscellaneous things that we can't do on Shabbos. It's like a sort of a mixed bag of various gezeras that Chazal made, which are caught in this simon. And the next thing is, we said at the beginning of Sif Daled, Ein Don, then you can't have a Din Torah, etc. And now we're up to V'lo Mekadchin. So that means you can't have weddings on Shabbos. You can't get married on Shabbos. Says the Ramah, although the Machaba says V'lo Mekadchin, says the Ramah, V'yesh matirin lekadish heicha dein le'isha bonim. If a person is not married or hasn't got children yet, then yesh matirin ve'ef shadu adin haknisa lechuppah shari. Even going into the chuppah would be allowed. Va'af al gav delei kaimel hachi. Even though we don't do this in practice, mikol makam soimchin al zeh b'shas hatchak. We can rely on this to have a wedding on Shabbos b'shas hatchak. V'gam ki gadol kavod habrius. Another factor is kavod habrius. Kamosh reginish nefam mishaloh yicholim lahashves im nedunya beim shishi at halayla. You know, they're haggling at the nedunya. You sometimes see this. I don't know if you've ever seen this at the ksuba, at the tish. In some circles, they're literally finalizing the nedunya there and then at the ksuba. 99% of weddings that you go to, it's all done and dusted, and they just sign the ksuba and there's no problem. Sometimes there's real negotiations taking place, and so that's what he's referring to. And therefore, sometimes b'yom shishi adarayla, the nedunya is not finalized. The nedunya is the dowry. In other words, what the color brings in, what finances the color brings into the wedding. And therefore, since it takes you so late into the day, you actually do the wedding on Friday night. You've already prepared the whole meal, and if you don't do it now, there's going to be a huge loss. And it's going to be quite embarrassing for the chos and kalim if you don't go on, press on with the wedding. But you should try and avoid that scenario, that you're delaying things so late on Friday afternoon that it spills into Shabbos. Okay, let's see the Mishnah Berurah up to that point. We're up to Sif Cotton Tes Vov. V'lo Mekadchin. So you can't have a wedding on Shabbos. Just by the way, what about engagements? So he says in number 16, even if it's through a kinyan. So to get engaged and whatever on Shabbos, that's not particularly a problem. But even kinyan suda, which means you're making a kinyan. Like you see sometimes at a vot, right? A kinyan is made. Through a kinyan, if you're doing a kinyan suda, that's a problem. Yeah, to just someone get engaged, that's not a problem. But through a kinyan is a problem. In other words, you can shake hands. Of course, we're not talking about the chos and kala shaking hands. We're talking about the two fathers shaking hands. An agreement to get engaged is fine, but not to do an actual kinyan suda. Okay, carrying on the Mishnah Berurah Tesvav. Why aren't you allowed to get married on Shabbos? What's the problem? A gezerah shema yichtov. To kaina kinyan b'Shabbos. The problem is not that we're making a kinyan on Shabbos, that he is kaina the isha niknes b'shleisha drachim, etc. Topic kiddushin levad b'lei chuppah loy kono adayin liyarsha lemetzio lemaisiyadeo. Because through the actual just giving her the kesef kiddushin, it hasn't been a full kinyan for various purposes. For example, liyarsha. For example, if he were to die at that point, she is not yerish him. Or the other way around, he's not Yerush her, or Lemetziyasa, and things which she finds, her Metziyas, are not passed on to him at that point, or Lemaisyodeha, and he hasn't got any rights to her Maisyodaim, the productivity of her work, her income. And even if the Kiddushin was before Shabbos, the Mechaba says further on, you can't actually go into the chuppah on Shabbos. And the reason is because it's the chuppah which is Gomer the Kinyan, and therefore he's kaina her in respect of the three things we mentioned above. And therefore it's a problem of mekach umemka because the Kinyan has taken place, and that falls foul of mekach umemka. Now, what's the problem of mekach umemka? If you look at 17, he says, because mekach umemka is itself a problem because of shema yichtov. So therefore, we don't have chasnas on Shabbos because of shema yichtov, and not because of a kinyan per se, because the kinyan per se will only happen at a slightly later point. Okay, now it says that the Ramah, however, we said yesh matirin lekadesh in certain situations. For example, if ein le isha bonim, says the Mishnah Berurah Sif Katan Tezayin vuadin v'yesh le bonim ve'ein le isha, or a person could be in a different situation where he has children but he's not married, then that would also be allowed. Gam kein mutar l'de'azu, the mitzvah ka'avet kedamrin b'yavamas mikra b'beike zera izarecha ule'erev al tanech yodecha, which is the famous pasuk that it's a mitzvah to have children more than the basic pru uravu requirements of a boy and a girl. There's a mitzvah of al tanach yodecha. Ve'ef shedu hadin, and it could even be, what's this going on? Yud Zayin. Ve'ef shedu hadin haknisa lechuppah shari. Yes, says the Mishnah Berurah Yud Zayin. Rotzolema af al yedei hachuppah kaina isol lekama dvarim, like we said above. V'chanal afilu hachi given the less la isha bonim yesh b'zeh mitzvahs pri uravia sfir leid yesh la hakol b'zeh. That even for that we allow the chuppah as well, not just the kiddushin, in a situation where there's a mitzvah of pruruvu. And then he carries on and says, "V'afagav delei kaimel hachi rotzolema v'yesh hefsed rav al dezeh." Sorry, I've missed the line. Rotzolema demeika din kaimelon kashitus Rashi v'shar rishonim dekiddushin v'afachupa also b'Shabbos v'yontiv. So the Ramah says, but meika din you should avoid Shabbos weddings because we paskin like Rashi and other rishonim that kiddushin even the chuppah is also b'Shabbos and yontiv. However, then the Ramah carried on and said, but in a situation where the things were delayed, either because they were discussing the Nadunya and it spilled into the night time, we can allow it. Shabbos on a Friday night because you prepared the whole Suda and it would be a massive loss. Plus, there'll be embarrassment for the Chassan and Kala. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Rotzolema Yisif Katan Yutes, Rotzolema V'yesh Hefsed Rav Al Yedei, because the whole meal is going to go to waste. V'ayin b'chai Adam shekasuv she'ein lo hakel b'chol zeh rakim nishlemu hashleisha pratim. We're only makel if you've ticked 3 boxes. Dahainu im loki im purivya adayin. We're talking about a situation where the person has not yet been mekayim mitzvah purivu, and v'yesh hefsed rav, because of the costs of the Suda, v'gam biyush lechasen v'kala, and there's also going to be that embarrassment factor. In lo yichle soz, if you're going to not get married now and you're going to delay things. V'ayin mashekosavna b'siv kotten tezayin, even in a situation according to Rabbi Tam where the person does have children already, he would allow it just for that alone. If we're talking about ben hashmoshes, i.e. between shkia and nacht, you don't have to be machmir because that is a ben hashmoshes. It's a l'tzorech mitzvah. We're not geyser on ben hashmoshes not to get married. But don't cut it so fine that you get into that situation. Because you're encountering a whole host of problems. What problems are you encountering by having a Shabbos chasna? Number one, tiltul muksa shel haneris. Would that be the first on your list? Interesting. The first thing is, when you walk the chasna and kala down to the chuppah, the parents are holding neiris. So you've got tiltul muksa al neiris. V'gam kama noshim holchus lechuppah mu'char zman adlokas haneris al dezeh. And then if everyone's going to the chuppah and they haven't yet lit candles, what are they going to do straight after the chuppah? They're going to run home and light candles, madlikas ben hashmoshes, and they're lighting candles super late, ben hashmoshes. For yosei tov ha'ishal ladlik oz klal. And better you don't light then. Yeah, Amir La'akum would be allowed to tell a guy to light the candles, ben hashmoshes, if a woman is running late. You shouldn't light after shkia. But he says better to not light then. He doesn't mention the Amir La'akum point. And therefore, says Mishnah Berurah, you're much better off and it's much safer to avoid Friday afternoon weddings of a prat samach l'chashecha, and certainly if they're very close to Shabbos. Kiaf im Hanesuin yeh bizman. Even if you call the chuppah at a time and you keep to the time, I'll call upon him mistayif mizeh oid kama kilkulim. You can encounter a whole bunch of problems for chanal. In this acha chuppah hashashecha over bidei hashishbinaneris. Then what happens if it did happen? You had a Friday wedding. I think in Israel it's becoming a bit popular. But let's say it spilled not from the lunchtime to the afternoon, and then it got later and later, and then it got so late that it's getting dark and you're holding the candle still. So and the sheshpinen, i.e. the people who are walking the chas and kala down to the chuppah, are holding candles. After even though the general rule, if you remember back in Shinches, when you're holding muktzah, you're allowed to carry it to its destination, and therefore you can actually still carry them and put them down. And by the way, in footnote 22, he says we're talking about where the candles have gone out, because holding lit candles is much more problematic. Best thing to do is to pass them over to an Ein Yehudi. So whenever you can get rid of the muksa, you should try and do that. Okay, let's carry on now. We're back at the top, the second line. You can't do chalitza nor yibum. Nor can you have the nisuin. V'lo makdishin, you're not allowed to make something hegdish. V'lo ma'arichin, v'lo machrimin, v'lo mafrishin, trumas and maestros. The Mishnah will explain all these terms. V'ein paidin haben, you can't have a pigeon haben on Shabbos. V'ein megarshin, you can't do a gerishin. LMK, who gets shchiv mera. The Takifle Alman, as we're talking about a situation where the husband is deathly ill and we're worried, we want to avoid the Yibam situation. And in all of the above cases, if a guy went and did it, Shaygin Oymezidin, Oymutoin, whether it was Shaygig, whether it was Mezid, or it was a pure mistake, Masha also Osui. Lamaisa it's Chal. The Gerushin is a good Gerushin, the Kiddushin is a good Kiddushin, etc. Says the Mishnah Berurah Sivkatan Chof. So you can't do a chalitza. Why not? Says the Mishnah Berurah, because we're worried you might come to write the shtar. And that's what Rashi says. Because it looks a little bit like a din Torah. If you've seen a chalitza ceremony, it looks very much like your, a din in Beis Din. You can fix on Motzei Shabbos that the chalitza will take place on Sunday. And fixing the date, even you can do on Friday afternoon. You can fix the date on Ben Hashmoshes on Friday night that it should be on Sunday. If you can't fix it up otherwise. You don't do Yibum. What does that mean? Because the Yibum is you're actually doing the Kinyan. It's like Nisuin. And therefore it's like a Kinyan. So you've got those problems for Yibum. That's why you can't do Yibum on Shabbos. Even if the Kinyan, i.e. the giving of the money of the ring, the Kiddushin, i.e. Erisin, took place before Shabbos, still you can't do the chuppah and the nisuin afterwards. Also lachnisa l'Shabbos, Shabbos l'chuppah, the b'chuppah kaina isa l'kama dvarim, as we said above, v'chanal, because he takes a ma'aseh yadayim and his yerusha, etc. So therefore, completing the wedding on Shabbos is also a problem. V'lo magdishin. What does that mean? It says in Mishnah Berurah Chaf Gimel, shum davar ligvaya. You can't make something hegdish for ligvaya letzarech gvaya sheyem harizu hegdish. Mishum tekimin shemagdish b'mirosa hachefes lehegdish harimutzia b'mirazu hachefes mishus l'rishus gvaya v'dami lemekach umemka. Because it's going from one rishus to another, and it looks like a business transaction. Masha'en kein lifsek stocker aniyim is mutter, but to give stocker to aniyim, to pledge money, is allowed. In fact, look at 26, an interesting note. V'linder litin mois lechazan. Yeah, to say I'm going to give a certain amount of money to the chazan. Kosva shulchan aruch le'el. We said in Shinvav, shenagu lehakel bekach ubiya Mishnah Berurah sham shemuter lasos kein af im chazan osher. Even if the chazan is a wealthy fellow and he doesn't really need the money, it's not a stocker sort of situation. Kiven sheyesh bezeh mishum tzorech mitzvah sheis ba'alef ne'amad. It's important to have a good chazan, and therefore pledging the money is considered the tzorech mitzvah, and it's worthwhile doing. Back to the Mishnah Berurah. V'chein k'sheyem ahari olayla hegdish kach v'kach gam kein muta v'ayne el b'simin shinvav b'Mishnah Berurah sivkot and chof zayin. We dealt with it there. V'lo ma'arichin chof dalet sheyem arki olay. You can't say that the lashon, the whole parasha of Erchin, my value is on me, which is again a form of giving money to stocker. Or erich ploni olay, or the value of that person is on me. Shenoisen lehegdish kafi shonov, dependent on the years, the age of the person. V'ave kameka chumemka. V'lo macharimin. What's that? You can't dedicate an animal or an item letzorech gevaya for the Beis Hamikdash she'em harizeh dov acherim, or for just for hegdish purposes. V'hava kol mitamanal or mashikosav v'lo mafrishin. that you can't set aside something. It's very similar to that you being magdish, let's say, Paris, that you've set aside ligvaya. You're fixing it. And if you went and separated, if you went and did it b'mezid, then you've got to wait till Motzei Shabbos because it's like a knas. But if it was a mistake, then you're allowed even for you straight away. Okay, next on the list was lo mafrishin trumas and maestros. You can't separate trumas and maestros on Shabbos. Chavov v'uadin chala, and so too chala v'ayin le'al b'simin reish samachalef Mishnah Berurah sivkot and dalet. There we spoke about the fact that on chala what you can do is you can eat, if you forgot to be mafresh chala, you can eat the challah and the bread, in other words, and then leave over a bit at the ends, and therefore that's a neat way of dealing with it. But not to be mafresh trumas and maestros on Shabbos. Ve'ein paidin. You can't redeem things. Even a kli, in other words, sorry, you can't do pidyon haben. You can't do pidyon haben because you're giving money to the kohen. It's a transaction. It's a proper transaction. And afilu, says the Mishnah Berurah, Sivkot and Chav Zayin, afilu b'chli sheshava chamisha slime. Even if you've got a kli which is worth 5 slime, and I give that to the kohen, I'm not giving him money. I'm giving him a kli which is worth 5 slime. I can't do that because it's like business. It's like mekach memka. Ve'ein lo mayitin amos like kohen be'erev Shabbos. And don't say that you'll give the money to the kohen on erev Shabbos. Uchshegia yom hashloshim ve'echad b'Shabbos she'ozu zman pidiyah yochel hapidyon. And then Mimela, the pigeon will take effect automatically. Because then you can't make the bracha on the pidyon haben. Because you can't make the bracha at the time of the pigeon because it's not yet day 30 or day 31. And if you're going to say it's going to be chal at the time of the pigeon, then you have the pidyon haben on the Shabbos, but then nothing actually is happening. So you can't make the bracha at the time when you set aside the money, or at the time of the day 31. And therefore you just wait until after Shabbos, until Sunday or whatever. Which is exactly a month, right? In other words, it's 29 days and 12 hours and 793 chalokim since the child's been born. Yesh hashon echlekes letof tof reish fei chalokim kiyodua to 1,080 chalokim, as is known. Shu hacheshbon shel chodesh. That's the proper cheshbon of each month. Nevertheless, you don't redeem him on a Friday because the Torah says 30 days finished. And therefore you've got to have arrived at day 31 at the time of the pidyon haben. And therefore if day 31 falls out on the Shabbos, therefore you push off the pigeon until after Shabbos. Okay, you can't do a gerushin on Shabbos. Even if the get is of course written before Shabbos, we still do not allow it. Why not? Because you might come to write something and therefore you don't do a gerushin on Shabbos. Unless the man is tokef leyitzre, tokef le'alma. Says Rashi, says Mishnah Berurah, Hainu shereitze legarish ishte kadei shelo tizakek liyibam. The guy is about to pass away, and therefore we want to avoid the Yibum scenario, so therefore we allow that on Shabbos. Because he might get very distressed if they don't do his wish. We're not talking about there's a problem with the dates, because otherwise if you've got a problem of a get mukdam, you've got other issues. You don't write it the Friday date. This week, the kosher b'chiyai gavna, that would be allowed in this situation. And then we concluded and said that at the end of the day, if you did it, whether it was shogeg, mezid, or muta, or mistake, masha osa osui, says the Mishnah Berurah, avol akol hamavua b'siv zekoi, chutz me'afroshas trumas u'maestros, to be anulel, demifrishim b'mezid, osa b'bayom. All of them, if you went and did it, it's okay, unless you are mafresh trumas u'maestros, which is one of the things listed here, then you got to wait till Motzei Shabbos. Shogeg hu kohen sheshachach shayom Shabbos, or shechoshev shedov zeh mutar lasos. That's always the case of shogeg. Shogeg is one of two things: either you forgot it was Shabbos, or you didn't know this thing was also on Shabbos. Let's just do hey. It's just short, and it's related to what we've just discussed. Says the Mechaber, hakonis suamona, A man marries a woman who's a widowed, she's been married previously. Lo yavu alei bia rishena, lo b'Shabbos v'lo b'Yontav. You shouldn't have the first bia on Shabbos or Yontav. V'ayin simin reish pei. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why not? Hatam sivkot anamad beis the ba'almona v'chein begerushin kimin shehi be'ula. She's already married and therefore she's not a basula, she's a be'ula. Ika kinyan lirushos l'mais yodea hi habia v'lo hachupa. The kinyan is affected by the bia and not by the chuppah over there, and that's what's going to affect the Yerusha and the Ma'aseh Yadayim, etc. And therefore, for an almona, this is going to be considered a kinyan. V'ayim be'evan ha'ezeh simin samach dalet si'if hey. The be'er sham ha'machav, there the machav explains, the af ba'almona lo bo'in the bia mamish. We don't need a bia mamish for this kinyan to take place. V'sagi ha'isa yichud ha'roi lebia liknois al edei zeh kinyan gomer. In other words, if they go to the yichud room and the room is properly secluded, you don't have to have beer there, but this is a yichud haroi lebia, that would affect the kinyan. So even to do the yichud to do the wedding of the almona, where they get married and there's a proper yichud room, even because it's a yichud haroi lebia, that would also be a problem because that's going to affect the kinyan. Ulafizeh imkonas effect with an e. Ulafizeh imkonas oisam be'erev Shabbos v'hoisu Torah. Therefore, the fallout of that is that if the chuppah takes place on a Friday and she is tahira, v'ichnisa acha chuppah lecheder mibayjem v'nisyachid imo v'lo hayisham bnei adam, and it was a proper yichud, there was no other people there, and it was properly secluded, then that would be the kinyan. Kona oisa kinyan gomer muta achach lava aleh b'Shabbos. And then, since the kinyan took place on Erev Shabbos in that situation, then the bia rishon would be allowed on Shabbos. Avalim lo oisa tahira mibayjem. But if she was not tahira, if the yichud room was not a properly secluded room, also lava aleh b'Shabbos, because that's what's going to affect the kinyan, and that's not allowed on Shabbos. And therefore, if you are arranging a chuppah on Erev Shabbos for an almona, you've got to be very careful. You've got to make sure that the chuppah takes place early on Friday afternoon, that the yichud is a proper yichud, that it's the kinyan will take place on Erev Shabbos. V'da, even with the basula, that you should make sure that the chuppah is a proper chuppah on Erev Shabbos. Because standing under the chuppah that we call is not properly affecting a kinyan. She's just mureses, or she's just mukudeshes. It's not properly nisua. It's not that you haven't done the proper yichud. That could be doing the kinyan on Shabbos, which we're trying to avoid. But with the basula, it would be sufficient to have yichud before Shabbos. So long as it's some form of a yichud, that would be sufficient. Even if, therefore, she was a nida, and therefore it's not going to be a yichud haroi lebia. People are coming in and out of the yichud room. And therefore it's not a proper yichud haroi lebia. Alpha pikein havi chuppah gemura is still considered a chuppah gemura. V'kainu basula kinyan gomur lehem havi kinasui b'chol dvarim. And therefore that for a basula that will be sufficient. V'tzarich liyachid lechasan oisa hacheder v'havi kachnisa lebeisai. It's got to be that the chasan is it's his room as it were, and he's being machnis her to his house. V'alkein im konis is a basula be'erev Shabbos v'hichnisa lecheder mibaydoim. Like we just said, the belav hachi yesh asur lisyachid imay koydem bia rishona afilu hachi kaina isa. Then that's considered okay. Because he's bringing her into his room. And therefore, when she afterwards is teveles, and therefore there'll be no problem of kinyan on Shabbos. Because the kinyan really took place on Erev Shabbos. And therefore, even for a basula, you're much better off to make sure that it happens, early on Friday afternoon, so you don't encounter these problems. Okay.